The sun hung low over the dusty Texas plains, painting the horizon in shades of burnt orange and deep purple as Marcus Reeves guided his horse along the narrow dirt road. He'd been riding since dawn, making his way back to the ranch after delivering a herd of cattle to the stockyard in San Antonio. His body ached from 3 days in the saddle, and all he could think about was a hot meal and his own bed. The road stretched empty before him, nothing but scrub brush and the occasional mesquite tree breaking the monotony of the landscape. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that the exhaustion and the fading light were conspiring to create mirages. But as he drew closer, there was no mistaking what he saw. 2 small figures huddled together on the side of the road, barely visible in the gathering dusk. Marcus pulled his horse to a stop and squinted through the dimming light. Children, 2 little girls, sitting in the dirt with their arms wrapped around each other, as still as stone. Something cold settled in Marcus's chest. He dismounted slowly, not wanting to startle them, and approached with careful steps. The girls didn't move, didn't even seem to notice him at first. They just sat there, staring at nothing, their faces smudged with dirt and tear tracks. "Hey there," Marcus said softly, crouching down a few feet away from them. "You girls okay?" The older one, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were enormous in her thin face, dark and hollow with a kind of emptiness that no child should ever know. The younger girl, perhaps 5 or 6, kept her face buried against her sister's shoulder, her small body trembling. "We're waiting for Papa," the older girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said to wait right here." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He looked around at the empty road, at the wilderness stretching in every direction, at the sky growing darker by the minute. "How long have you been waiting, sweetheart?" The girl's thin shoulders lifted in a small shrug. "I don't know. A long time. Since morning, maybe, or yesterday. I can't remember. Yesterday." Marcus couldn't keep the alarm from his voice. He looked at the girls more closely now, taking in their torn dresses, their bare feet covered in cuts and blisters, the way their skin seemed stretched too tight over their small bones. "When did you last eat something?" The older girl looked away, and the younger one began to cry softly, a sound so heartbreaking that Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd seen plenty of hardship in his 32 years, had known his share of suffering during the war and in the hard years that followed. But there was something about these 2 small souls, abandoned and starving on a lonely road, that struck him in a place he'd thought had grown too calloused to hurt any more. "What's your name, honey?" he asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered, "and this is my sister, Emma." "Well, Sarah, I'm Marcus, and I'll tell you what I think. I think your papa might have gotten lost or delayed somehow, and it's not safe for you girls to be out here all alone in the dark. How about you come with me? We'll get you something to eat and a safe place to sleep, and then we'll figure out how to find your papa. Does that sound all right?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time Marcus saw a crack in the brave facade she'd been holding up. "He told us to wait," she said, her voice breaking. "He said he'd come back." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, hot and bitter, at whatever man would leave these children alone to starve, but he kept his voice soft and steady. "I know, sweetheart, but you've waited real good, and now it's time to get you somewhere safe. Your papa would want that, wouldn't he? He'd want you to be safe and fed." Sarah looked down at her sister, at Emma's gaunt face and hollow eyes, and something seemed to crumble inside her. She nodded slowly, and fresh tears began to stream down her dirty cheeks. Marcus felt his own eyes burning as he stepped closer and gently scooped Emma into his arms. The child weighed almost nothing, just bones and ragged clothing, and she didn't resist, just pressed her face against his chest with a small, desperate sound. "Can you walk, Sarah, or do you want to ride the horse? I can walk, Sarah said, but when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Marcus caught her with his free arm and lifted her as well, both girls weighing less together than a sack of grain. He settled them carefully on his horse, then swung up behind them, wrapping his arms around them to keep them secure. As they rode through the darkening evening, Marcus felt Emma's body relax against him, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. Sarah stayed rigid for a while longer, but eventually she too began to lean into his warmth. Marcus looked down at their matted hair, at their thin arms and haunted eyes, and made a silent promise that whoever had done this, whoever had abandoned these children to die, would answer for it somehow. The ride to the nearest town took 2 hours, and by the time they arrived, both girls had fallen into an uneasy sleep. Marcus carried them into the doctor's office, where Doc Harrison was just preparing to close up for the evening. The old physician took one look at the children and immediately went to work, laying them on examination tables and calling for his wife to bring water and food. Lord have mercy, Doc Harrison muttered as he examined them, his weathered face grave. These girls are severely malnourished. Another day or two, and... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Marcus could see it in the doctor's eyes, in the careful way his hands moved over the children's fragile bodies. Who would do such a thing, Mrs.? Harrison asked, her voice thick with tears as she gently cleaned the dirt from Emma's face. What kind of monster leaves children to starve? Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight. I don't know, ma'am, but I aim to find out. Over the next few days, as the girls slowly recovered under the doctor's care, the story emerged in fragments and whispers. Their father, a man named Roy Bennett, had been a drifter and a drunk, recently widowed and unable to cope with the responsibility of 2 young daughters. He'd told them he was going into town to find work, had left them on that roadside with nothing but each other and a promise he never intended to keep. The sheriff made inquiries, sent out telegrams, but Roy Bennett had vanished like smoke, probably halfway to California or Mexico by now, leaving no trace except the 2 lives he'd tried to discard. Marcus visited the girls every day, bringing them books and small toys, sitting with them while they slowly learned to smile again. Sarah, the older one, had taken to following him with her eyes whenever he was in the room, as though afraid he might disappear too. Emma was slower to warm up, but eventually she began to reach for him when he arrived, her small hand grasping his calloused fingers with surprising strength. What's going to happen to them? Marcus asked Doc Harrison one evening as they stood outside the office, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The doctor sighed heavily. The orphanage in Austin will take them, I suppose. It's not a bad place, all things considered, but it's overcrowded and underfunded. They'll be fed and clothed, at least, but... He trailed off, and Marcus knew what he wasn't saying. The orphanage was survival, not life. The girls would grow up as numbers, not names, would learn to expect nothing and hope for less. Marcus thought about his ranch, the small spread he'd built up over the past decade through hard work and careful saving. It was nothing fancy, just a modest house and enough land for a decent herd, but it was his, and it was more than enough for 1 man. Maybe it could be enough for 3. The idea terrified him. He was a cowboy, a bachelor who'd never planned on having a family. What did he know about raising children, especially 2 traumatized little girls who'd been abandoned by the one person who should have loved them most? He could barely manage to feed himself properly, lived on beans and hardtack half the time. How could he possibly be responsible for 2 human lives? But then he thought about Sarah's hollow eyes, about Emma's trembling hands, about the way they'd looked huddled together on that roadside, waiting to die. He thought about the orphanage, about the girls growing up in a place where they'd be safe, but never truly wanted, never truly home. And he thought about his own childhood, about the years he'd spent in a similar place after his parents died in a cholera outbreak, about the cold, impersonal kindness that had kept him alive but left him hungry for something more. He couldn't let that happen to these girls. He wouldn't. The next morning, Marcus met with the sheriff and the town judge, a process that involved more paperwork and questions than he'd anticipated. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Catherine Wheeler, looked at him with undisguised skepticism. "Mr. Reeves, do you understand what you're proposing? These are young children who have suffered significant trauma. They will require patience, care, and resources. Are you prepared to provide those things?" "I am," Marcus said firmly, meeting her eyes. "I know I'm not much, ma'am. I'm just a rancher, and I can't promise them fancy things or a life of ease, but I can promise them a home, a real home where they'll be wanted and cared for, where they'll never have to wonder if they're going to be left behind again." Judge Wheeler studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the papers before her. "The fact is, Mr. Reeves, that the state would be relieved not to have 2 more mouths to feed in the orphanage system. Your references are good, and Doc Harrison speaks highly of your character. But I want to be clear. If you take these girls, they become your legal responsibility. You'll be their guardian, and that's not a burden you can simply set down when it becomes inconvenient." "I understand that, ma'am, and I don't intend to set it down, ever." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Judge Wheeler nodded slowly and signed the papers. Just like that, Marcus Reeves became the legal guardian of Sarah and Emma Bennett. The girls took the news differently. Sarah, cautious and wounded, watched him with guarded hope, as though afraid to believe that this might be real. Emma, younger and more resilient, threw her arms around his neck and refused to let go for a solid 10 minutes, sobbing into his shirt while he patted her back awkwardly and tried not to cry himself. The first few months were harder than Marcus had imagined possible. The girls woke screaming from nightmares, convinced they'd been abandoned again. They hoarded food in their bedroom, stuffing bread and biscuits under their pillows and in their drawers, unable to trust that there would be another meal. Sarah would wake before dawn and check every room in the house, counting to make sure everyone was still there, while Emma would fly into a panic if Marcus was out of her sight for more than a few minutes. Marcus learned patience he never knew he possessed. He learned to cook proper meals, not just trail food. Studying a cookbook like it was a military manual. He learned to braid hair, though his attempts were clumsy at first, all crooked parts and loose strands. He learned to read bedtime stories with different voices for the characters, to check for monsters under the bed, to understand that sometimes a hug was worth more than any words he could offer. Slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice it happening, the girls began to heal. Emma's laugh, when it finally emerged, was like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sarah started to relax her vigilance, started to sleep through the night, started to be a child again instead of a tiny guardian carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. They stopped hoarding food. They stopped checking to see if Marcus was still there every 5 minutes. They started to believe, truly believe, that this was real and permanent. The ranch became a home in ways Marcus had never experienced before. Sarah developed a love for the horses, spending hours in the stable talking to them and brushing their coats until they gleamed. Emma claimed the kitchen as her domain, standing on a stool next to Marcus as he cooked, her small hands helping to knead bread dough or stir soup. They planted a garden together that first spring, and Marcus found unexpected joy in watching the girls' excitement as the first green shoots pushed through the soil. The townspeople, initially skeptical of a bachelor rancher taking in 2 young girls, slowly came around. Mrs. Harrison took it upon herself to teach the girls proper sewing and manners, while Doc Harrison made regular visits to check on their health and development. The schoolteacher, Miss Emily Porter, went out of her way to help Sarah catch up on the education she'd missed, often staying late to work with her one-on-one. There were difficult moments, of course. Times when Sarah would wake up crying for her mother, when Emma would have a meltdown over some small thing because she still didn't quite trust that good things could last. Times when Marcus doubted himself, wondered if he was doing right by these girls, if they deserved someone better, someone who knew what they were doing. But there were also moments of perfect, unexpected joy. Like the morning he found Emma in the kitchen before dawn, trying to make him breakfast as a surprise, even though the pancakes were burnt and the eggs were somehow both raw and overcooked. Or the evening Sarah called him Papa, for the first time, almost by accident, then burst into tears and apologized before he could tell her it was the best word he'd ever heard. Or the countless quiet moments on the porch at sunset, the three of them sitting together in comfortable silence, watching the sky change colors while the girls leaned against him, safe and loved and home. 2 years passed, then 3. The girls grew taller, stronger, their faces filling out and losing that haunted, hollow look. Sarah developed a stubborn streak and a sharp wit that kept Marcus on his toes, while Emma's sweetness hid a surprising core of steel. They were smart and resilient, funny and kind, and Marcus marveled every day at the privilege of watching them become who they were meant to be. On the anniversary of the day he'd found them, Marcus took the girls back to that spot on the road, though it took him a while to convince Sarah it was all right. They stood there together, looking at the place where everything had changed, where 2 lives had almost ended before they'd barely begun. "Do you think about him?" Marcus asked Sarah quietly. "Your father?" She was silent for a long moment, holding Emma's hand. "Sometimes," she finally said, "but not the way I used to. I used to think about why he left, what we did wrong to make him not want us. Now, I just think about how sad it is that he'll never know who we became. He'll never know Emma's terrible singing, or my way with horses, or how good we are at making you laugh. He threw away something precious because he couldn't see its value." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. His loss, he said firmly, his terrible, unforgivable loss. "But your gain," Sarah said, looking up at him with a smile that still had the power to break his heart and mend it at the same time. "You stopped when you could have kept riding. You cared when you didn't have to. You loved us when we were unlovable. That makes you our real papa, you know, not him, never him, you." Emma nodded vigorously, squeezing both their hands. "You're our papa," she agreed, "the best papa in the whole world." Marcus pulled them both into a hug, these 2 precious souls who had taught him more about love and courage than he'd ever thought possible. They'd healed each other, he realized, all 3 of them wounded in different ways, all 3 of them finding in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. As they rode back to the ranch, the girls chattering excitedly about the birthday cake Mrs. Harrison had promised to help them make, Marcus reflected on the strange paths life could take. 3 years ago, he'd been a lonely cowboy with nothing but his horse and his land. Now he was a father, and he couldn't imagine going back to that solitary existence, couldn't fathom a world without Sarah's stubborn independence or Emma's infectious giggle. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Marcus sat on the porch with his coffee and looked up at the stars. He thought about the man who had left those children to die, wondered where he was now, if he ever thought about the daughters he'd abandoned. He hoped Roy Ben it never found peace, never stopped looking over his shoulder, never forgot what he'd done. But more than that, he hoped the man stayed gone, stayed out of their lives forever, because he'd forfeited any right to these girls the moment he'd driven away. Sarah and Emma were his daughters now, not by blood but by choice, by love, by the daily act of showing up and caring and putting their needs above his own. They were his family, and he would protect them with his last breath, would give them every opportunity he'd never had, would make sure they knew, every single day, that they were wanted and loved and home. Inside the house, He heard Emma call out in her sleep, a small sound of distress. Before he could move, he heard Sarah's voice, soft and soothing, comforting her sister back to sleep. Marcus smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. They were all right. They were all right. The cowboy who'd been riding alone that evening 3 years ago was gone, transformed into something he'd never planned to be, but couldn't imagine not being, a father. And those 2 little girls, left to starve by the side of a dusty road, had become his reason for everything, his purpose and his joy. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the greatest blessings come disguised as the hardest challenges. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. And sometimes, when a tired cowboy stops his horse to help 2 starving children, he doesn't just save their lives. He saves his own. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.